Welcome. This webinar is part of our educational series called Clinical Trials Explained, Know Your Options. Our goal with this series is to help patients, caregivers, and families better understand clinical trials so they can feel informed, empowered, and confident when exploring their options. So far in this series, we've covered the foundation of clinical trials, how research advances into patient care, how to use TRICAN's platform, what clinical trials are currently available here in Michigan, and the enrollment and discovery process. Today, we're looking at this from a different lens, through a patient's perspective. A few quick housekeeping notes. All attendees will be muted and video will be off for the duration of the program. Please feel free to insert questions in the chat at any time. This session is also being recorded so it can be shared with others who may benefit. My name is Annie Dalton Flores. I'm the Executive Director of Sky Foundation. I'm joined by Jamie Geyer, our business manager, who is behind the scenes, but happy to help in the chat if anyone on the webinar needs help with connection. She will share her information in the chat if she has not done so already. Sky Foundation is a Michigan-based nonprofit organization focused on raising awareness and funding innovative research for the early detection and treatment of pancreatic cancer. This organization was founded by pancreatic cancer survivor Sheila Sky Castleman. Sheila created Sky with a simple but powerful message to make sure no patient is facing pancreatic cancer alone. She understood firsthand how overwhelming a diagnosis can be, the uncertainty, the decisions, and the feeling of not knowing where to turn. And she wanted to build something that would really support patients and families every step of the way. Sheila was not a clinical trial participant herself, but she deeply believed in the importance of advancing research. One of the most meaningful ways she contributed was by donating her tumor to research, knowing that even if that didn't directly impact her own care, it could help future patients. That act speaks to who she was. She was not only a survivor, but an advocate, someone who believed in pushing the field forward to make sure that others had access to better options, better information, and better outcomes. And that's really what today's conversation is about. Because while clinical trials and research are critical, the patient experience, the decisions, the emotions, the unknown are just as important. At Sky, we're here not only to fund research, but to support patients in understanding their options, connecting with resources, and learning from others who have walked this path before them. At Sky, and that's why we're so grateful to have today's panel. Individuals who are willing to share their stories so that others don't have to navigate this journey alone. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to hand it over to our partners in this webinar series, TRICAN Health, to explain how they help patients in a big way as well.
Thank you, Annie. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be collaborating with Sky Foundation on this really important series about clinical trials. TRICAN Health exists for one simple reason, and that is to make sure that every patient with cancer has access to potentially life-saving treatments through clinical trials. And for those who don't know, clinical trials are where the drugs of tomorrow are tested. All drugs have to be tested in a clinical trial before they are approved. And so the most exciting advanced treatments of tomorrow are in clinical trials today. And in fact, if you've been watching the news, we've heard a lot over the last week or so about a really exciting new targeted therapy that has shown that it doubles survival rates in a clinical trial for pancreatic cancer. So that's incredibly exciting news. And it underscores the point that the exciting drugs of tomorrow are only available right now in clinical trials. So it's really important for patients to be aware of clinical trials, to understand that they are a treatment option, and to know how to find and navigate clinical trials. But unfortunately, that's quite hard to do often for patients. And so TRICAN is on a mission to change that. We want to make it easy for patients to find trials. We want to help them know where to look, help them understand their choices, and empower them to have conversations with their physician about clinical trial options. And we're starting with pancreatic cancer. The work that I do in founding TRICAN Health is extremely personal for me. It is based on both my professional background and my personal experiences. So I have spent my entire career in cancer research and drug development, starting with my PhD at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I continued my work for the following 2 decades after my PhD, looking for better drugs for cancer patients. But it wasn't just about my professional experience, it was also about my personal experience. I myself have been diagnosed with breast cancer twice. I know what it is to sit on the receiving end of that call telling you you've got cancer. And I also was a caregiver to my mother, who was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and unfortunately only survived 18 months. So this work that I do with TRICAN Health is extremely personal for me. And I knew I wanted to do something to help patients learn more about clinical trials, but I wasn't sure exactly how to do that. And that's where my co-founder, Mike, and his expertise in software and tech come in. So Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kimmy. Hi, I'm Mike Harris, co-founder with Kimmy and TRICAN Health, and our last name being the same is not a coincidence. We're married, and while Kimmy was getting her PhD at U of M, I was at the Ross School of Business getting an MBA and spent a career in technology. And the key thing that I learned is there's an ability to build a platform, a capability to bring together multiple parties that want to connect. So specifically, we're talking about the trial sponsors, someone who's running a clinical trial, the physician who's advising the patient about the clinical trial, and most importantly, all of you, the patients who are looking for treatment options, to find what those treatment options are to make a best match. So we built the platform on TRICAN Health to help do exactly that. So with that, let me turn back to Annie to introduce our panel members today, because I'm excited to speak with both of them. Annie?
Thank you so much, Mike. Talk about power couple. That is amazing. I love how you guys started TRICAN Health together. And I'm excited to now introduce our speakers. First, we have Rob Wecker. He is a 3-time cancer survivor, including 11 years as a clinical trial participant and pancreatic cancer survivor. With over 25 years as a pharmaceutical executive, Rob brings a unique perspective to the patient journey. Switch this over. He serves on a patient advisory council for pharmaceutical and biotech companies, health systems, and advocacy organizations. He also authors a blog called Through the Patient Lens. Through his experience, Rob encourages patients to make informed decisions by understanding their options, weighing risks and benefits, and choosing the best path for themselves and their loved ones. We also have Greg Adams, who is a pancreatic cancer survivor and advocate whose journey reflects resilience, determination, and the power of informed decision-making. At the time of his diagnosis, he was given less than a 1% chance of survival. Refusing to accept those odds, Greg immersed himself in research and became a strong advocate for his own care. He pursued multiple treatment options, including serving as patient number 1 in an MRI-guided focused radiation clinical trial. Now 7 years beyond his diagnosis, Greg shares his story to encourage others to explore every option and stay actively involved in their care. Moderating these 2 gentlemen will be Mike Harris, who introduced himself briefly with TRICAN Health. He is obviously our moderator today and co-founder of TRICAN Health, a platform dedicated to helping patients, as you heard just a moment ago. Through his work, Mike focuses on improving access to clinical trials and empowering patients with the tools and information they need to make informed decisions. Welcome, Rob, Greg, and Mike.
Fantastic. Thank you for a great introduction, Annie, and thanks again for the opportunity to speak on behalf of Sky Foundation and all of your community. Gentlemen, I'd like to start just by asking you a little bit about your stories to explain sort of how you went through your journey. And Greg, maybe I can start with you, just to give us a sense of your diagnosis and so forth. And I realize that it's been years that you've gone through this, but we want to cover a bunch of topics. So if you can keep it to maybe 30, 60 seconds, that'd be fantastic. Just tell us a bit about your story, please.
Yeah, when I got my diagnosis, I took a look at possible clinical trials. Like Annie said, I was given less than 1% chance of survival, and I was classified as non-resectable candidate. And, that really limits your odds and what your options are. So my original focus was to become a resectable candidate, to figure out how to get there. And that ended up being a little more challenging than I anticipated. I did look at clinical trials at that time and could only find two, and I didn't qualify for either one. So we just did the standard treatment. I went into FOLFIRINOX chemotherapy and took the highest dose they could give and was able to knock the cancer back a little bit. But having the cancer shrink by 30%, I qualified for radiation and got into that. The radiation did its job, and I'll explain a little more later, but that rendered me a resectable candidate. And I had 2 Whipple surgeries after that, to deal with, they took out the primary tumor on the first and then had to go back in and take out other cancers, other tumors after that. But, and I'll give a little more detail on that. But the key thing was 8 years ago, I could only find 2 clinical trials anywhere in the country. And there was no Trican Health out there to help. The difference that 8 years make. I did a search on Trican Health for my condition just several weeks ago. And what was it? 296 clinical trials currently running popped up in the list, a phenomenal increase. So I'll go on in more detail on the other issues later, but that's my 30 seconds or so.
Fantastic. So 2 Whipple surgeries, radiation, and a search for clinical trials, all as part of your path. And it sounds like there's much more to it as well.
Yes.
That's impressive. Rob, let me ask you about your personal experience.
Yeah, so mine's slightly different, but same overall tone. For me, my pancreatic diagnosis was the 3rd time I had cancer. So previously I had testicular cancer in 1991 and liposarcoma in 2010. And the way I tell the story, Mike, is that those 2 were just sort of practice runs because, as everyone on this call knows, pancreatic cancer is a different ballgame. And for me, what I knew when I saw the statistics early on, with a 4% at the time 5-year survival rate, I knew I needed to be aggressive. So for me, aggressive meant looking at trials and what was possible, and sort of went through the process. And Greg, if you think 8 years ago things were hard to find, let me tell you, 12 years ago they were even harder to find. But I did find a trial. I went on a high dose of vitamin D trial given in conjunction with chemotherapy, which, similar to Greg, I actually was resectable when I was diagnosed, but the theory of the trial was that vitamin D would help stabilize the tumor, perhaps shrink it and make it more accessible for the surgeon. So that's sort of the backdrop for me, Mike.
Fantastic. I'd like to pivot to some current news. Kimya mentioned this in her introduction, and Rob, you mentioned it in some of the conversation we had prior to joining the call, which is that in today's New York Times, there was an article regarding new pancreatic cancer therapy approaches. One, a targeted therapy, and another, an mRNA vaccine. I know neither of you is a scientist per se, and I'm not asking you to go into detail, but if you have any initial thoughts, if you happen to read that article or other ones around recent news in the past couple of weeks around these innovations, happy to just get your thoughts in terms of how you react having gone through treatments yourself, having participated or looked at clinical trials, and what your thoughts are on these newest innovations. I'm happy, Rob, if you want to take first shot.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, it's great news to see, and the way I look at these things, it's yet another tool, or tools in this case, for the toolbox in an area that is quite limited at the moment in terms of what the tools are and the capabilities. So I think, for me, Mike, one of the key things is that throughout the journey, I think patients should be exploring all options available to them at any given point in time, and that helps them make the best informed decision around what treatment to pursue for themselves and their family. So for me, this type of information is great. Once we get an approved drug, all the better, all the greater access for patients out there who need it.
Greg, any thoughts?
Yeah, I keep my eyes open for anything I can take advantage of to prevent the cancer from coming back. And one of the trials, the targeted, was good for patients that have genetic markers that can be addressed, the KRAS, different versions of the KRAS gene, the BRCA2 gene. In my genetic profile, there isn't a marker for any form of pancreatic cancer. And in fact, they can't find a marker for any form of any cancer known to man at this point in my DNA. So there's nothing to target. So I can't take advantage of any of those trials. But the most recent one that showed the 50% benefit from the mRNA vaccine, what caught my attention there was, first, I was excited as hell, thinking, my God, there's finally something out there that maybe I can take advantage of. But when I took a look at the participants who did not benefit from that trial, the other 50%, 6 of them had no spleen.
Hmm.
The body cannot, the spleen is the organ that the body uses to build up immunity from vaccines. So when I had my surgery, I ended up getting an infectious disease doctor as one of my team members now, because vaccines don't really work for people who don't have a spleen. I may get maybe a 20, 30, 40% benefit from the flu shot, from the COVID vaccines, and I get them just for that protection. But I will never be able to, my body can never mount a full 100% protection, a full response. So what they found is the 6 participants who didn't have spleens in that trial, their bodies did not mount a response to the vaccine high enough to provide benefit. But they are working on trying to figure out how to improve that immune response, even without the spleen being present. So they've got a little more digging to do, but so far I haven't seen any clinical trials other than a few. There's one in Europe where they can do a sequencing of your cancer itself from the cancer they took out. They can find markers on that cancer that at least will do a blood test to see if it comes back over time. So they're beginning to work in areas that may benefit me long term.
Mm-hmm.
But it's going to take a while to get there. I think part of the problem in my case is there just aren't enough patients who have my profile for both genetics and cancer condition, to benefit from, because there's so many variations and every body is different.
So it's interesting. I was taking notes while both of you were speaking, and 3 takeaways that I just want to highlight that you each mentioned. Greg, you were just talking about the importance of getting genetic markers, right? So understand your own genetics, so sort of what is inherited or what's called germline, and then other genetic markers, biomarkers that can come from the tumor itself, or what's
Yes.
called somatic. So getting that information can help target therapy, and that's going to become increasingly important as more and more therapies come to pass. So I think that's one observation. And then Rob, you said something that I'm sure you'll want to come back to later, which is, patients should explore all options at any point in time, right? To make sure that you're looking at trials and other options at each sort of decision point in the cycle. And I think that's important. And then one other thing that I'd like to highlight, and this comes back to you, Greg, is you said you had an infectious disease expert on your team, which would never have occurred to me. And yet the point of assembling, Team Adams in this case, to make sure that all these folks were sort of focused on the complete picture of your care, sounds like an incredibly important thing. And I'm sure you and your family had to be, advocates for your care during that process.
Yeah, and because I have no spleen, I have to do what doctors carry a pill in the pocket. I carry amoxicillin with me or doxycycline with me every place I go, so that if I get any elevated temperature at all, I have to start on antibiotics immediately, and then go to the doctor to find out what's causing it, because infections can take over the body very rapidly when you don't have a built-in immune system. So,
right.
But the advantage I see is to my descendants and other people in my family who haven't lost their spleen already. The mRNA vaccines could be very beneficial for any of them.
Mm-hmm.
And until we find a targeted genetic defect that is in the family tree, because 11 members of my immediate family have contracted adenocarcinoma of the pancreas, and I'm the only survivor so far.
Wow. That is a sobering familial statistic, and I hope that the rest of your family is as vigilant and focused on the disease in terms of early detection and prevention as best as possible.
Yep.
Greg, you had said that you had found 2 trials only at the time 8 years ago. You didn't qualify for any. Rob, you said you were even, they were harder to find, 10 years ago when you were, or 11 years ago when you were looking. Rob, let me ask you, how do you advise patients to ask their medical team, their physician, how to ask about clinical trials? Because I get that from a lot of patients where they say, my doctor didn't mention it to me and I don't want to offend them. I don't want to think I'm going around their backs or anything like that. How do you advise patients to ask about clinical trials in your care? And Rob, I'll start with you.
It's a good question, because I think a lot of places that you go either don't have clinical trials in pancreatic cancer if they're a small facility. Certainly if you go to some of the larger research-oriented, NCI designated facilities, of course, they'll have better access to clinical trials. I think it's sort of part of the relationship with the doctor that you need to sort of establish up front, right? So I'm fairly blunt with my doctor and sort of, suggested to her that, I'm open for anything and want to look at anything. But I think I've learned a couple things over the years that might be helpful. One of the questions I encourage people to ask is, of their doctor and their team, have they looked at clinical trials? And oftentimes you'll hear the response back, well, yeah, we looked at clinical trials, but we couldn't find anything that was really good for you. So we suggest that you go on standard of care. And I always encourage people to ask a follow-up question with the doctor, which is, well, where did you look? Because oftentimes what I've found is that the doctors basically look at their own facility to see if there are any trials sort of under their roof. And if so, then they might suggest it. It's the rare doctor who takes the broader look who will say to you, no, Rob, we don't have any trials here at University of Pennsylvania where I got treated. However, I see 2 trials down at Johns Hopkins down in Baltimore. And if you're willing to travel from Philadelphia down to Baltimore, you should consider those options. So for me, Mike, I always sort of scan a broad map. I'm like, I want to know if there's a perfect trial for me. And I don't really care initially where it is. So if it comes back and says, yeah, there's one trial you're a really good candidate match for, and it's in Paris, right? Then the question, which is my question, is, okay, is it worth it for me? Can I go and participate in a trial in Paris or not. And if I need to apply a constraint that says, well, that's not really viable for me and my family, I need to look at some other alternatives that are local, right? So I think sort of that flexibility is important, but I think patients need to sort of be honest with themselves, right? In terms of, okay, what can I do? What can't I do? And sort of, live within those bounds.
Greg, any thoughts you'd want to add?
Yeah, this was a topic that came up last evening in a large support group meeting, nationally last night. And I pointed out something that everybody just chimed in and agreed with, and that is, over the last 5 years, I've worked with almost 100 newly diagnosed pancreatic cancer patients. I am a mentor for Imerman Angels and Sky Foundation. And, Mike, I've sent some patients to you,
Yep.
to look at clinical trials. But one of the things I've noticed is your odds of survival are often tied to where you are, what medical facility you go to in terms of their experience at handling pancreatic cancer patients and conditions. If you go to a facility that has a pancreatic specialty, that focus on it, team approach in particular, Johns Hopkins, Henry Ford, Mayo Clinic, MD Anderson, people who focus on pancreatic cancer issues, they're going to be far more knowledgeable about clinical trials, what's going on not only in their own area, but outside of their area. And I think one of the things that caught my attention just recently was one of the clinical trials, that was, I think, one of the ones you referred to, Mike, will now ship the medication to your location for your local hospital to deliver the medication to you. You don't have to travel anywhere. It's a pill form. And I was stunned when the FDA authorized that ability to eliminate the travel. And this may become more common in the future. I think the industry is learning how to run clinical trials better than they used to be run. It used to be one location and you had to go to it. A good friend of mine here 3 years ago went to one called the Padre trial in Philadelphia. He'd had the Whipple surgery, but he was panicky about the cancer coming back, and he wanted to try a vaccine to prevent that. So he traveled from here to Philadelphia for every injection.
Yeah. So what I hear from both of you is location matters. And, what you just said, Greg, is that, when you want to make sure that you're working with a facility that has, pancreatic cancer as a specialty and that team approach ideally. And Rob, you described it, which is kind of, another way to describe the same thing, which is NCI designated facilities. And for those of you who are looking at your treatment location options, you can easily Google that at the NCI site, the National Cancer Institute site, NCI designated cancer facilities. There's a list of them, and they are comprehensive cancer facilities all around the country, including many of the ones that Greg just mentioned. So that's a great example. And Rob, I love the way you asked, where did you look? So when the physician says that they look for trials and gosh, we didn't see any that were appropriate. Where did you look is a good way to expose potentially that they haven't looked broadly enough to find those 200 plus trials, Greg, that you said you looked on, just recently, even for your, specific indication. So there are a lot of options available. They may not be close to you, but typically there are some that are within driving distance, and there are options to even get in further ones. So that's terrific.
So Mike, can I just add sort of a bit of an industry perspective, right? Because I sit
Please.
on several pharma patient advisory boards, and the companies are definitely aware of the issue, right? In terms of everything from how their documentation is very difficult to read, so if people have to go and review an informed consent form, it's written by 30 lawyers and 50 PhDs, and it's very difficult for a patient to sort of try to understand it, let alone get through it. So one of the things the patients are sort of constantly pushing is the need to make it understandable, digestible, I think part of the issue around retention on clinical trials is because at the end of the day, when people sign up, they're not really crystal clear what they're committing to, and down the road eventually say, oh, can't sort of commit to what they need to do. So I think companies are trying to become more flexible. They're certainly looking at opportunities, as Greg sort of outlined, to be, if we can do more things remotely, if we can do things more locally, such that, a patient who maybe lives, in a remote part of Ohio doesn't have to drive 3 hours to go to the Cleveland Clinic for a trial, but that they can do it somewhere locally. So I think there's a lot more flexibility trying to be built into the system. I think the FDA is encouraging companies to do that and doctors to do that. So again, now part of the challenge is, okay, well, so how do I find it? Trican Health's a great vehicle to do that. But we need to get better, because
Sure.
I could envision the future where it's not patients who are finding trials, but it's trials who are finding patients.
Absolutely. And one of the questions that we just got online, which is that kind of information. So Rob, you're saying, the ability for trials to be more available, or the example you gave, Greg, of the one where the pill is actually shipped to the patient's home. The question is that kind of information found when you search Trican Health's platform, if a trial can be shipped to your home? And the answer to that is happily yes. We actually highlight in each of the trials how the medications are given. So if it's by IV or sometimes by injection, sometimes by pill, sometimes it's another type of procedure like surgery or others, different forms of trials, of course. But each of those is identified on the platform. And we also indicate if the drug may have been FDA approved for some other cancer indication. Sometimes it's been approved for liver cancer and is being evaluated for pancreatic cancer. Therefore, it's in a clinical trial, and we highlight that FDA approval if it's appropriate.
Yeah,
So excellent,
Mike.
excellent point. Please.
Yeah, one comment. In the past, years ago, when I first started looking at clinical trials, my primary source was, I think it's clinicaltrial.gov.
Mm-hmm.
And the language was written for researchers only and legal experts. It was very difficult to figure out what it was all about, whether or not I even qualified for it. It was difficult to read.
Yeah.
And I think this is an unpaid advertisement for you. When I ran across Trican Health and took a look at the clinical trial data there, it was the kind of material that a layman could understand. You might need to open the medical book a couple times, a dictionary, look up a few words, but it was understandable. And that's what I really appreciated. There was no source for that kind of information other than if I heard about a clinical trial on clinicaltrials.gov, I would go to where that was being run, like Sloan Kettering, and look it up on their website to see if they translated the language from the clinical trial documents into layman's terms.
Right.
And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. So, yeah, it's very beneficial to have it in layman's terms so you can understand what it is you're looking at.
Yes. And
sorry, I was just gonna build on Greg's point, which I think Trican Health does an excellent job of sort of translating, what is heavily PhD material into something that patients can understand and sort of absorb. One of the other big issues is, I'll say, sort of the currency of what's out on clinicaltrials.gov. And one of the things we keep pushing back with pharma companies is, if that information isn't up to date, Trican Health can have the best search engine in the world, but they're searching off primarily clinicaltrials.gov data, right? So if companies are lax or slow updating either sites or where things are available, it's just that much more disconnect between the patient and ultimately the trial itself.
Agreed. That's why we kind of think of it as that triangle of all three parties really have to be working together to get good communication. One of the questions that just came in online is about cost of participating in a trial. And I know both of you counsel patients who are considering trials and other treatments as well. Um, does insurance cover clinical trials cost? Is that something that's covered by the sponsor? What falls in between those things? There's an example of someone whose family is worried because the father who has pancreatic cancer is in upstate New York, maybe trying to get treatment in other parts of the state, and that travel cost is a real concern. How do you counsel patients and caregivers to think about those costs? Whom do they ask about whether those costs are covered for a particular trial? How do you counsel patients to manage that? I'm happy for either one of you to start.
How I handle that is I've sent two people to you, Mike. Um, it turns out that the clinical trials generally pay for all of the costs of the trial. There's nothing that your insurance company has to deal with. There aren't any fees for you. All of the costs of being a participant in the trial generally are covered by the trial. And I've worked in 18 clinical trials and research studies myself, but in other fields, brain health and sciences. So we had to cover the costs for all of the participants, even travel costs sometimes. Um, but in this case, if you do have to travel out of state, there are services, there are um, people who loan their aircraft, geez, I can't think of the name of any of them right now,
Skyhope
but
is one that I'm familiar with.
yes, that's one of them. Where you can catch a flight, take an empty seat on a commercial aircraft from your location to wherever the clinical trial is going to be held. And they'll bend over backwards to try to work out their schedule so that you can take advantage of that if necessary. So there are resources to deal with some of these costs, but generally there aren't any to the patient if it's in your local area.
So I guess my comment would be, so arguably in the informed consent form, right? They sort of at a fairly high level try to describe what costs are covered and what costs aren't covered. Typically, the medicines and other things are covered by the sponsor. When you get into sort of the need around testing, so scans or blood work or stuff like that, um, oftentimes there's a question of whether it's sort of considered sort of part of normal treatment so that your insurance would sort of cover it on a normal basis versus the sponsor. One of the big pushbacks I've given to sponsors is saying it would be ideal from a patient perspective if I were reading an informed consent form, if I saw language that was very specific, that would sort of say, okay, we're going to bill your insurance company for whatever standard blood tests need to be done. But if they don't cover it, we, the sponsor, will cover it. Right. And what does that do? I mean, from my perspective, that helps the patient really understand sort of what their financial exposure might be in terms of the study itself. Right. So I think there's a whole area around, I'll say, the medical aspects of the coverage. But then there are other issues, and Greg picked on, travel. There's travel, there's potentially daycare. Do I have to stay overnight? There are a whole bunch of other costs that could come into
Mhm.
play. And I think it's important, again, for me, coming back to trying to make an informed decision, I really want to understand all that financial exposure. So I would have a list of questions that you could ask either the representative at the site or who could take it back to the sponsor in terms of really understanding, okay, if I have to come in for the full day, but I have to travel 4 hours in car, will someone put me up overnight or not? And how about my caregiver? Do they need to be there? And will you provide meals? And how about parking? Because yeah, on an individual basis, parking's not a big deal, but if you're going into a site 3 times a week for, 6 months, that's a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
So I encourage people to be very clear and get,
Mm.
commitment in terms of what's in and what's out. And I would always encourage people to press back, right? And say, well, we don't typically provide meals. Okay, but you want me to come into the site and I'm going to be there for 8 hours. I think you should provide me with lunch, type of thing, right? So again, I think you need to have the conversation, but by and large, I would assume most of the costs, certainly most of the medical related costs, will be covered.
And Rob, building on the points of costs, can you tell us a little bit about sort of the day-to-day experience, sort of the real life experience of what kind of time frame was it between when your medical team identified the trial, maybe you identified the trial, and sort of enrolling in the trial? Like how much time elapsed between finding it and actually starting the trial? And then tell us a little bit about sort of the day to day. And specifically what I'm trying to understand is it really different being on a trial compared to standard of care? What are those differences? And did you notice that difference? I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about your experience that way.
Yeah, I can. I mean, mine's a little bit different because my trial was sponsored by Stand Up to Cancer. So it wasn't a particular pharma company or somebody else doing it. I think one of the most important things, I'm just going to take a slightly macro step backwards,
Sure.
right? I think one of the important things when considering what type of treatment to go on is to really understand the delta between the two, right? So you'll hear oftentimes a lot of organizations are saying, well, we want to minimize the burden to the caregiver and the patient and all of that. And those are all very nice high level words, right? But when you get down to it, what does it really mean? The way I look at it is, particularly with pancreatic cancer, once you get a diagnosis, I'm burdened, right? 2 weeks ago, I didn't have pancreatic cancer. Now I do. Whether I'm going through standard of care or a clinical trial, it's a lot more intensive than it was 2 weeks ago when I didn't have cancer, right? So I think when people look at it and they say, wow, this is really burdensome, I always say, well, how is it different between the treatment you're going to get on standard of care versus the treatment you're going to get on the clinical trial? Because oftentimes a lot of the regimen is the same, right? And maybe you do some extra blood work because they want to follow things, or you have a couple of additional scans, or maybe they want to do a biopsy at the beginning and at the end. So there's some additional things that are associated, particularly with the trial itself. But I think the bulk of the treatment is going to be, similar. While I'm here, look, can I just bust one myth, right?
Sure,
Right,
please
which
do.
is I'm
Yeah.
going to say it's the placebo myth around clinical trials,
Yeah.
particularly as they relate to oncology and cancer. And
All right. So Rob, if I'm
basi-
going to voice the myth, it's that, hey, I don't want to be in a clinical trial because I might get a placebo and you won't treat my cancer, right? That's the myth. So please
correct. The
bust it
myth
for
is
me.
the myth, right? The myth is that there's a possibility that you're going to get a sugar pill, and every patient's going to say, "Oh my God, I've got cancer. I don't want a sugar pill. I'm not going to even consider a clinical trial." That option doesn't exist, right? So when you go on a trial, you either are put on standard of care therapy or you're put on the what's being tested therapy. So you will always be treated, right? And there is no such thing as the pure, no, you're just taking a sugar pill treatment arm. That does not exist on an oncology clinical trial.
Thank you for busting that myth. Greg, I'll give you an option. You can bust another myth if you'd like, or you can talk a little bit about sort of what it's like to be a patient going through the day-to-day treatment stuff and kind of what you experienced.
Yeah, I don't have any other myths to bust. I thank you for Rob for bringing that one up, because that is a common one I run into. People are scared to death of being put into the control group and not getting any treatment. So you really presented that one well. How I got into my clinical trial was kind of by accident. It was not a clinical trial I even knew about. After my chemotherapy was successful at shrinking my tumor by about 30%, my immune system tanked. They stopped the chemo and said, "Well, geez, you're making such good progress. you qualify for the radiation. Let's just shift gears and go into the radiation now. And they were planning on the 35-day general radiation treatment that was standard of care 8 years ago. And I was halfway through the instructions, from the radiologist when someone came into the room, Parag Parikh. And he said, "Mr. Adams, would you be interested in a clinical trial?" And I said, "I don't qualify for any clinical trials that I know of." He says, "No." He said, "One for radiation." And I said, "Well, what is it about?" He says, "Well, we take the 35 days that you're going to be going through and we compress it into 5 consecutive days." And I thought, nah, I'm not interested. That's, they're going to cook my guts trying to compress, 50 GYs of radiation into 5 consecutive days. And he says, no. He said, it's a machine that targets the tumor within 1 millimeter accuracy. And I thought, wow, because the normal 35-day hits an area that's almost half an inch to 3/4 of an inch larger than the target that they're going after. So most of the side effects and damage caused to the body is caused by peripheral damage to those organs from a radiation that isn't targeted. And I said, "Oh, okay, well, tell me more." And then it dawned on me that packing it into 5 consecutive days would get me potentially into surgery 30 days earlier. And when you've got that alien growing in your body doing what it does best, and that's become metastatic and spread, every day counts. So I thought, well, hot dog, uh, let's go for the 5-day radiation. So I signed up for it on the spot. We went over the finances. There were no costs. The difference was we went from about a 45-minute treatment to almost a 2.5-hour treatment session, which meant you had to be in that MRI machine. It's 8 feet deep, so your entire body is in a tube just about the diameter of your body. So if you have any kind of claustrophobia at all, you will not survive, at least without Xanax. But it got a little more difficult when I got into it, because if you even twitch, the body shifts and you have to start over again from scratch. They have to rescan the body for 45 minutes, build up, the digital image of the body and the tumor and what they're targeting and where it's at and how it's moving, because the tumor is moving all the time because of your breathing, your heartbeat, digestive processes going through. So it's constantly on the move. So we had to do the radiation. The guns would shoot only when I would exhale and hold my breath. Now think about that. You empty all of the air out of your lungs and you can't breathe for 90 seconds. Okay, your body is just screaming to suck air back in. And it's really difficult to shut that off. Your body and brain goes into a panic mode. I actually used training. I worked undercover in Vietnam, and I had to go through training for how to survive torture, capture, and being a POW. I ended up using that training to mentally get through this protocol. Okay, hindsight, 8 years go by, they're still doing this procedure, but they're using an open machine, and the protocol has been modified so that it's not as difficult to get through as possible. But the accuracy is still there. They've reduced the amount of time you're in the machine. And it did. It knocked my cancer back far enough that they could actually see space between the tumor and the mesenteric blood vessels. So they said, hot dog, they're not involved. You qualify for surgery now.
Wow.
Okay. What we didn't know was 6.5 hours into the surgery, I never did qualify for the surgery, because the tumor had grown through the pancreas, out the other side, through the mesenteric arteries, and anchored itself to the back of the abdominal wall. None of that showed up on the scans. But a second surgery was they did some experimental work that had never been done before successfully. They were able to splice patches into the mesenteric blood vessels with blood vessels that they had removed from the other organs. They really pull a rabbit out of the hat, the surgical team.
Yeah.
And they did a hell of a good job. Every stitch stuck. So I'm here to talk about it.
What a great story of perseverance, of a crack medical team and the willingness to try new things and make them work and work through it. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and that takes me back to that topic about where you go for your treatment has a significant impact on your survival potential.
Great point.
Like I said, I've counseled probably close to 100 people so far in the last 5 years. Of those that have passed away, half of them did not die from the primary cancer. They died from complications that their medical professionals weren't prepared to handle.
Yeah. Hey, Greg, what center did you get treated at where all that surgery took place?
Henry Ford Health in Detroit. They follow the Johns Hopkins model, but they do have a dedicated pancreatic cancer team, and they now have a dedicated pancreatic cancer research department. So they keep up on everything, the clinical trials, new surgical techniques. They're now using the Da Vinci for less invasive Whipple surgeries, so they're really, really on the ball.
So I'm gonna bring us to a conclusion because we've had a great conversation. Before I ask you a final question, so I'm giving you a second to think about your answer. So the question I'm going to ask, and Rob, I'm going to ask you first, is what would be the parting thoughts that you would share with folks in the audience? People going through pancreatic cancer, what parting thoughts would you offer to them, particularly in relation to clinical trials? So I'll ask each of you that question. Rob, I'll ask you first, but before I do, I want to summarize something that I heard from both of you, which is that, and Greg, when you were talking about the different types of trials and things, some people don't know that trials can include different forms of surgery, different types of radiation, or immunotherapy, targeted therapies, chemotherapies, all these new things that are coming out. So don't think of it just as a drug trial necessarily. It can be procedures and surgeries and radiation as well, all of which can be new and emerging, all offered only through clinical trials as they work their way through. So let me just ask the parting question, which is, what would be your parting thoughts that you would leave for the audience? Rob, recommendations that you would have? You may be muted, Rob.
Sorry about that. First, just thanks for the opportunity from the Sky Foundation and TRICAN Health to sort of share our stories and perspective. And to anyone who's listening to this, feel free to reach out to me if I can be of any assistance to you. I guess I would say you need to be a pretty forceful advocate for yourself in terms of really taking hold of your treatment path and what makes the most sense for you and your family. As you know, I over time developed what I consider my North Star, which is that patients need to be able to make informed decisions at all points of their treatment path. And to me, that means considering all aspects out there, understanding what are the benefits, what are the risks, what are the likelihood of occurrence associated with each treatment option, and then decide which is best for you. And I think tools like TRICAN Health's Clinical Trial Finder are invaluable to people to, find trials that best fit and meet their needs. And I think it's very important. I think Greg has said this several times, and I would concur fully. Where you get your treatment matters, right? Now, there might be advantages to doing it locally, but I would encourage people to have some kind of connection to an NCCN facility where they study pancreatic cancer. They're more aware of research opportunities that are out there. So if that's using them as second opinion, if that's using them to sort of be the quarterback for your treatment, but you're getting treated locally, I think having that level of engagement and insight of, breaking new news in the field, because it is constantly breaking, is important to have as part of your toolkit that you're looking through.
Excellent. Excellent. And Greg, we've got about a minute left. What would be your parting thoughts for everyone on the
All right.
call today?
I agree with Rob on that issue. Don't be afraid to fire a doctor that isn't doing what you feel needs to be done. If they're not paying attention, if they're not willing to listen, if they get upset if you ask about a second opinion, you're working with the wrong doctor. There are a lot of doctors out there. You need to find the ones that are willing to work with you in your journey. You do have to be an advocate. But one of the things that I run into a lot are people looking for the pill that will cure everything, the simple solution. Pancreatic cancer is a journey that has a lot of twists and turns in it, a lot of complication. You need to look at clinical trials as one of the options that will be likely a part of your journey. Standard of care aspects of it may be a part of that. You need to build a protocol and a set of procedures that fit your particular needs. In my case, it was some standard of care plus a clinical trial. And I'm still looking for clinical trials that I can use for follow-up, to prevent the cancer from returning. So it's a package. And you need to look at all of the options and pick and choose what parts of what's available out there work best for your situation.
Fantastic. Well, Greg, Rob, thank you very much for your comments and thoughts today. And congratulations on all that you've gone through and continue to advocate for other patients. Annie, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Greg and Rob, for sharing your experience and cancer story with us today. I know many people will find this invaluable and very helpful. As always, thank you, Mike, for your incredible moderation skills. And lastly, thank you to everyone who was able to join us today. We will meet again for our last session on May 6th at 12 p.m. And I'll share that on the screen with you guys. This final session is episode number 6, Prevention, Genetics, and Early Detection. We hope you'll join us again. On behalf of Sky Foundation and TRICAN Health, thank you for being here and for taking the time to learn more about your options. We hope to see you next time.